is not really clearly defined, not in the research, not in the scholarship. There's folks who've interrogated it, but I think that for many of us, it's a bit vague, you know, and for some of us, it just refers to a standard of behavior that's exhibited by men in Mexican and Latinx cultures. But how would we define machismo? How would some of you define? Maybe in the chat, I would really love to open it up. I'm going to talk through how I come to understand this, but maybe we can start by some people chatting in, or maybe even giving some of their perspective, if you want to chime in on how you define machismo. Anyway, feel free to unmute, or feel free to, I don't know, there's a hand raise. I think maybe there's not a hand raise option, but if you want to share. Maybe Albenicio, I'll ask you, how do you define machismo? Like, what does that word mean to you?
Yeah, thank you. I was waiting for other participants to engage, but I see something that someone wrote in the chat. Says, I always see it as emotions being weak, don't express anything. And that's kind of really how I grew up. But being in education, I look at it differently, right? Like being a macho is, you know, holding your own and being able to, you know, take care of business and your responsibilities. You know, if you have children, you're being a good dad. I think there's so many intersecting identities that comes with machismo. And for me, I really thought of it as just taking care of responsibilities, doing what you need to do, and holding your own. That's kind of how I had seen it.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see some of the things in the chat now, people putting in there, you know, emotions are weak, right? Don't express anything. There's a callousness that sometimes comes with machismo, right? You know, belief that men are superior, right? That they need to be stronger and that they don't show their emotions. In Asian countries, it means strength over other and directing them as a way of thinking. You know, it's in terms of social standards, right? It's about manliness, right? As a Mexican woman, I grew up seeing males figures as superior, right? As the head of the households, and women being submissive to them. And so for me, a lot of times too, when we talk about machismo, that is some of the images and some of the norms that are conjured up, right? Another one that came in, machismo is marking difference between female and male. Women are weak and men are superior, and they do not have emotions. They're strong. Even if they abuse, they are better. And so again, these are some of those very visceral types of understandings of this really complex topic. Benicio also talked a little bit about machismo in terms of complexifying it. And I think that's really the importance of talking about this today is what does it look like? A couple of scholars have looked at it as well. Panitz, Lacanchi, Sabra, and Francesca look at it as an ethos comprised of behaviors prized and expected of men in Latin American countries. So that's some of what we saw in the chat, right? It's this way of coming to and believing of yourself as something in particular that's usually anchored to strength and to position and to superiority, right? Other scholars have looked, Arciniega, Toba, Gamero, and Sand look to it as Mexicans' men's manifestations of perceived male characteristics, both positive and negative. And so that's really interesting because Benicio kind of touched on this a little bit as well, is that, you know, machismo, I think for many folks, and I had this conversation with my dad, right? Because I'm going to talk a little bit about epistemology here as we progress, about how we learn what machismo is. You know, for him, within its original meaning, it's not only like something that's about being strong, but he was talking about how it requires men to also be hardworking, nurturing, brave, proud, and also emotionally connected. So he didn't see machismo in a completely deficit perspective. He saw it as more complex than that it can be deficit, right? And that it can be those things, but he is anchoring it to a larger sense of what it means to be male and part of family and part of this larger structure. So that was an interesting thing in talking to my father about that as well. And he was alluding to the same as these particular scholars were talking about, that there are both positive and negative aspects to machismo. And you know, I think what's really interesting is um, when we're talking about that, I think it's interesting to also talk about family. I see in the chat, you can still be machismo, but lose respect when they don't respect the other person and becomes a hated word and behavior. It is a leadership role in family and community, and person is wise as someone you can talk to explain life issues. Wisdom and machismo go hand in hand. The father also viewed as being the protector, right? So yeah, these are, again, we're talking about the very complicated and nuanced nature of machismo for many of us. And so I think that's really important. And I think we can also look, as we're talking about this, is that Vinicio mentioned the intersections of this, that a dear friend of mine who was actually here, Dr. Enrique Lopez, does a lot of beautiful work around familismo, right? And talking about what is the role of family. And when I'm talking about machismo and when I'm interrogating it, I think it's important for us to also look at it. And I love this definition of familismo as an enduring, multifaceted cultural value characterized by a strong identification to the nuclear and extended family through values that emphasize loyalty, responsibility, solidarity, and reciprocity. That's a beautiful definition of familismo, right? And when we think about machismo, if it was more anchored to that, right, as opposed to some of these other tropes that we see with it, that it's about strength and power and dominating and being valued for those types of things, right? If we can look to anchor machismo to something else, right, to broaden its definition, that would be a beautiful thing. And I think what would come out of something like that is also some of the work that we see from another colega of mine. And I have no qualms whatsoever shouting out some of my academic hermanos who are doing beautiful work. Dr. Manuel Espinosa does amazing work regarding dignidad. And he's talking about a dignified education. But for me, we can look to that work to say, what does it look like to have a dignified gender experience, right? What does that look like to think of ourselves in terms of being macho in a more fuller, broader definition, beyond just those limited ideas that it's just about strength and power, that it is anchored to reciprocity, that it is anchored to nurturing, that it is anchored to something else. And I think we can look to the work of these scholars to see that. And I see, you know, my other dear friend, Tony Salazar, put it in there, you know, like, you know, this idea of being a protector. And that's also what comes with that. But there can be something done to that from a pure way that doesn't belittle and doesn't minimize other folks. So I'm really excited to talk about this from a larger perspective and understanding it in that way. And I think when we start talking about that, it also begs us to ask some broader questions, right? Because we must talk about how machismo, it can be something better, but it is also can and very often does devolve into the insidiousness of hypermasculinity and heteropatriarchy and misogyny. So I'll open up this question again, maybe to some folks who want to chat, is how is machismo, you know, different than masculinity? So I'll start with that one. How is machismo different than masculinity? And if you're unmuted, we can't hear you, but I would love to hear some people's thoughts on that. Because as I was doing this work and thinking about this, there was a question that came up to me, right? Because we're talking about a lot about masculinity now, as we should be, especially as we are complexifying gender identities and what it means. Someone in the chat beautifully said that this is a differentiator between male and female, right? And there's many folks who don't fall within that binary. So how would we distinguish between machismo and masculinity? Maybe I hear typing, which is encouraging. So I'll wait to see what comes up. Machismo and masculinity can go hand in hand. Machismo is more extreme form of masculinity. Ooh, that's interesting, right? That machismo it can build on masculinity. So maybe with that same question, how would you do, like, how is then masculinity different than machismo? Like if it builds on it, what are the distinguishing factors between masculinity and machismo? As we mentioned earlier, I saw some of the definitions of that, and that begs an interesting question. How about machismo versus patriarchy? how are they distinguished from each other? Are they synonymous? Can they be seen as the same type of thing, just with in different languages? Because when I think of patriarchy, I think of something different, right? I think of, that's when I for me, when machismo goes there, it seems to start going into power and position and authority and those types of paradigms that exist within sometimes traditional family structures that do create a hierarchy in terms of family structure. I see in the chat someone said masculinity is being able to be yourself, do things for yourself, be able to protect as who you are, being able to express yourself as a male figure. Machismo is believing you are stronger than others, that you are better than females. Machismo versus masculinity. Masculinity is manly looking and machismo is a dominating presence. That's such interesting. I appreciate you all sharing that so much, because it just adds such nuance to this conversation around machismo. Because in preparing for this, I was really thinking about what that meant and what it meant for me. And I've been wrestling myself in and out of patriarchy and machismo for my whole life, and masculinity, and trying to understand what it means for me and what it means to society as we begin to better understand and become more aware of what these things mean. One of the very insidious things that can happen is when any of these start evolving into misogyny, right? Into what that means. And that is in terms of the objectification of others, right? In terms of seeing others as just something that you consume, that are not of value, that are just there to minimize. And so this is very interesting, because I see, and I have many folks even within my own family who will use machismo or maybe even masculinity as a mask to justify patriarchy and misogyny. And so for me, it's very interesting, and say culturally, hey, this is what our culture is, right? This is who we are. But it can come at a cost, and it could be deadly. You know, someone mentioned earlier about abuse. You know, these are real things that exist within our culture, and I think have really impacted people in very terrible ways. I wrote a paper a while ago, several years ago, called "The Macabre Maintenance of Misogyny," and macabre meaning, like, you know, akin to death and deadly. You know, that when we maintain misogyny, there are deadly consequences. How many of you recently in the news? There's an NFL football player. He's the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys, and his name is Dak Prescott. And he was very vulnerable and was communicating that he was struggling with mental illness, and that during this time he had to seek mental health assistance. And there was a particular reporter, his name is Skip Bayless, who ridiculed him for that, and who essentially, and I'll just read you actually the quote, what he said, because I don't want to do that. He said, and this is Skip Bayless talking about Dak Prescott, who was being who let everyone know that he was dealing with mental health issues. He says, "You're commanding this is Skip Bayless, quote, "You're commanding an entire NFL franchise. What's the roster now? 53 guys. And they're all looking to you to be their CEO, to be in charge of the football team. Because of all that, I don't have sympathy for him going public with, I got depressed. I suffered depression in early COVID to the point that I couldn't even go to work out." This is what he said about a man who was saying that he needed mental health support because he was feeling depressed. And just think of that quote. Some of the terminology in there is indeed, you know, very hyper masculine, right? He says, "You're commanding an entire NFL troop. You are the CEO. They're looking to you for power. You don't get sympathy if you show weakness." Now, what's really interesting about this is for Dak Prescott, addressing his mental health issues is very intensified because his brother committed suicide. So when I talk about the macabre maintenance of misogyny, and someone like Skip Bayless saying because he is an NFL quarterback, he somehow cannot show weakness, He cannot show these things. These are the types of byproducts that come out of this type of thinking that are so pervasive, especially in communities of color, where this type of weakness and these types of vulnerabilities are not valued and are often shunned, and we have to internalize them and then don't have outlets to go out. And some people end up struggling, and in the case of Dak Prescott's brother, taking their own lives. And so until we demystify this, until we begin to unpack what it means to be macho, and that it doesn't only mean strong, that it means so much more than that, that's when we need to start talking through some of those things. And I talk about this because the consequences can be deadly. And so for us to begin to do this, how do we hold each other accountable and hold those dearest and closest to us to promoting these types of deadly upholdings of norms that need to be undone, that need to be untangled? I look to my aunt, her name is Margaret Montoya. She wrote a beautiful paper called Máscaras, Trenzas y Greñas, Masks, Braids, and Tangles. How do we unmask? How do we braid a better identity? And how do we untangle our commitment to some of these very nefarious norms around what it means to be a man and what it means to be masculine and what it means to be macho? It's so incredibly important. I see some things in the chat and I don't want to kind of miss some of them. Tony says, it's interesting that I've never viewed patriarchy in a negative context because I've always seen it as a role in a family that goes hand in hand with matriarchy, a strong mother and father partnership. However, I was blessed with two parents growing up, and I know not everyone had that. And that is, I think for us, context does matter. I grew up in a matriarchy as well. I come from a family of some of the strongest women that I could ever imagine. And I'm so thankful to have grown up in a matriarchy with sisters as well. However, then, and we're going to talk about this here in a second, I was taught then patriarchy in other ways, right? Through media, right? Through music, and through other types of mechanisms that ended up being my teachers, and not all of them good. My own father, who I mentioned earlier, served several tours in Vietnam, and military culture is not always supportive of a nuanced understanding of masculinity. And so having a father who was damaged because of war, and learning and seeing patriarchy and learning from him what it is to be a man was also very difficult and confusing for me, because it didn't align to Tony, as he says, like what some of the matriarchal views that were kind of espoused in my family. Another one, in my father's family, they think that a woman is nothing without a man, because being a male is the biggest accomplishment you can have, and serving one makes you worth it. They think that you need to ask your husband to do something. For them, being a female is bad unless you have a husband and kids. And yes, mental health is there's some taboo. And if you're female, you're just oversensitive. But if you're male, then you're just not macho enough. Thank you for that very beautiful comment. And there's so much in that I probably could spend the rest of our time going through. But you're right that there's so much that is tied to those types of norms, right? Around that you're not, if women aren't married, and not without men. I have an amazing 19-year-old daughter who helps me better understand myself every day. My dear Mireya, who I remember when her mother and I had her 19 years ago, so many people putting so much value, like, hey, how much do you want that son? What about this son? And I was pushing back on that, because even at that time, I was trying to better understand myself and what masculinity meant. I was like, you know what? That doesn't bother me. And, Mahita, she was, before I had other children, she was my only child until she was 12. And I was very conscientious and very intentional about not allowing patriarchy and hypermasculinity to kind of, to impose itself on me in my raising of her. I didn't raise her any differently than I thought, and then when I had other children and I had sons, that reared its head again. Is that like, oh, now, how do you feel now that you have sons? And it just diminished so much of my Hita, as if like I wasn't a full parent until I had sons. And it was a very, created such disequilibrium in me that folks put so much emphasis on that, and how belittling it is to my daughter, whose value is not in her gender, whose value is in her humanity, right? And so for me, that's such an important thing that we need to unpack, you know, and with regards to daughters and sons, because, you know, I try to disrupt that as much as I can when people say those types of things. And here's another comment. To me, machismo is a limiting social practice and tradition, and I'm not interested in salvaging it. I've experienced it as an arbitrary and irrational power. I see machismo as something to escape, as I was able to do so because I am a father to 2 daughters. Escape toward what though? A fuller experience as a person, as a man, as a human. It is a tradition on life support, and I hope the power grids fail. I should have read that last because the great Dr. Manuel Espinosa speaks the truth, and he'll mic drop you on many occasions in the middle of your, you know, of many things. But I mean, so much of that is beautiful to talk about, and it's worth talking about. And I love that, you know, the call to kind of divest from these types of understandings of maleness is so important. How many of you know who this amazing scholar is right here? And I'll bring it a little bigger so you can see it. This amazing scholar is the great Bell Hooks, who has written some of the most amazing scholarship around pedagogy, around love, and also around gender. And she says this. She says patriarchy, and I think in some cases to what Dr. Espinosa was talking about, machismo, is the single most life-threatening social disease assaulting the male body and spirit in our nation. Yet most men never think about patriarchy, what it means, how it is created and sustained. That's why I'm so thankful, Benicio, to you, to allowing us to talk through some of this today, because it is assaulting not only the male body, but the implications that it also has on other genders, you know, whether it be female or those who don't identify on the gender spectrum. Patriarchy has a cost to those bodies as well. And until we begin to, as Dr. Espinosa talks about, let that life support fail, we can't do this. But you know, as much as I'm here talking about this particular phenomenon, I have to be very honest about my own relationship to patriarchy, masculinity, and machismo. And so therefore, I want to read a little something to you all, something that I wrote about my own experience with patriarchy and machismo. And I'm gonna read it to you because it's something that was necessary for me to reconcile in order to fully engage in this work and in my own humanity. So I want you to bear with me, and this next picture will make sense here in a second. And so let me read this to you all. This past week, the internet and social media were abuzz with Jimmy Fallon's Saved by the Bell reunion. Like so many others who grew up in the 90s, seeing the Bayside High gang back together was gloriously nostalgic. And there was a reboot coming out here soon. So Bayside is going to rise again. I can recall countless days sprinting home after the bus, dropping us off to catch the show and hear that equal parts wonderful and god-awful theme song from Saved by the Bell. As a young Chicano from the barrios of Albuquerque, Nuevo Mexico, it was a big deal to see Mario Lopez on television. And his character, Albert Clifford, AC Slater, was my hero, and I emulated my high school persona after him, curly mullet and all. To this day, many of my close friends in Nuevo Mexico still call me AC and post pictures of me side by side with Slater, as you can see right here on the screen. In high school, being a football player, wrestler, jock, and quote unquote man was such an integral part of my identity. I felt incredible pressure to be this person at all costs. This hyper masculinity was ubiquitous at my high school. Whether you were a jock, a gangbanger, a tagger, a rocker, displays of manliness and heteropatriarchy and machismo were normative and almost always celebrated. After watching the recent Jimmy Fallon sketch, I wanted to find an old picture with me of this legendary mullet to show my fellow doc students. Ironically, the evening before the sketch aired, I happened to bring up how AC Slater epistemologically informed so much of my identity as an adolescent. As I was searching the internet, I found out that classmates.com, yes, that site still exists, actually has scanned in thousands of high school yearbooks. I was excited because I'd lost my yearbook in my many moves. So nevertheless, as I was searching for my best AC Slater mullet pick, I began to browse the senior picture section. And I went page by page looking at my old friends who I swore that I would keep in touch with, which never happened. As I clicked on the next page, I saw his face. My stomach fell out from under me. I was looking in the eyes of the only openly queer kid that I recall went to this mecca of machismo that we called high school. As I stared at his face, I was bathed in embarrassment, guilt, and sadness. I remembered all the times that I tormented and bullied this kid. Having my older jock friends shove me into him, knocking his books out of his hands as I whispered, "Pick them up, fag," shooting spitballs in his face as we stopped waiting for the bell to ring at lunch. I remembered all the times that my actions eroded at my soul. In retrospect, I did not pick on this young man because I hated his lifestyle. Truthfully, I did not have any reservations about his sexuality. I did these atrocious acts because I was afraid and jealous of him. In a sea of pubescent wanderers, he seemed to be one of the few who actually had a grip on who they were. I was jealous of his confidence. I was nowhere near having an understanding of who I was or really wanted to be. Even though I was an above average athlete, I knew in my heart of hearts that I could not play at the highest levels. Despite this, I hung on to that delusional pursuit, declaring that with hard work in the weight room in the off season that I could defy the odds. He seemed to have none of these doubts, and disgracefully, I hated that. Looking back, I remember being jealous of how alive he was, how vibrant and sure of himself he seemed. There was an honesty that exuded from him despite incredible risk. And ultimately, that is what I was trying to take from him. In my shameful attempt to be a man and make him less honest, alive, and human, I proceeded to lose my own humanity. In writing this letter to this brave young man, I wanted and deserve no congratulations, for I'm a coward for subjecting him to such torment and for having not truly admitted it before. For far too many young LGBTQIA brothers and sisters and other non-gendered folks, they're taking their own lives because of behaviors and actions similar to my own. I can never fully understand the pain and suffering that I subjected this young man to. And I deserve to live with the shame and guilt that I feel on a daily basis. Much of the work that I do now focuses on justice, and yet I cannot truly commit to this work until I come clean of my own oppressive and hateful history. To the brave fellow high school colleague, I want you to know that I can never fully apologize enough for my actions and behaviors during our time in those halls. You were and still are a far better human than I am. But I want you to know that I'm fully committed to doing everything I can now to combat hatred, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and bigotry, and that my 3 children will know your bravery and the cowardice of their father in this moment. And as I write this, and as I rewatch the Jimmy Fallon sketch, and perhaps it's fitting that AC Slater traded in his wrestling singlet for a leotard and to dance. My hope is that just maybe he too is trading in this faux machismo for a more artistic and inclusive persona. And I know that I am. And I share that with you because I can't do this work acting as if I am, righteous and not with fault. There are things in my past that I have done not only to queer kids, but to women that are shameful, that I have to reconcile and that I have to work myself in and out of. And in doing this work, we need to be honest of ourselves and who we are. And so, I share that not to receive any praise because I don't deserve it, but just to let you know what the work that we have to do to kind of get ourselves in and out of this. So it begs the question here, how did you learn machismo? How did you learn patriarchy? How did you learn masculinity? The great James Baldwin, in a class that I took with Manuel Espinosa, he asked us to do our first works over and to go back and begin to understand, when did you first begin to start to understand what it is to be a man? And so I'll open that up. And there's some comments in here. I haven't been able to get to all of them, but I would love for some folks to share, where did you learn that? How did you begin to learn machismo? Where did that manifest from?
do you want us to share verbally or just share in the chat?
I would love for you to share verbally. Oh, Omar, so good to see you. Please do share. That would be beautiful.
First of all, I want to say thank you for reading what you read. It made me begin to reflect on some of the TV shows I grew up with, Good Times, The Jeffersons, and all of it was about men being head of the house, men being the head of politics, and men being the head of the social culture of families and the community. And that's how I was raised. And it wasn't until later where I began to realize that I was minimizing the women in my family and minimizing the women, strong women around me, because I had this concept that men always had to lead. So as I grew and matured and made some mistakes, and maybe just to be 100% transparent, probably had a few sisters check me, including family members, I began to realize that I have to change my thought process. And so I just want to say thank you for sharing that, because it reminded me in the 70s and in the 80s, where you always felt like, at least in my family and things of this nature, even who prays at the table, it was down to that. Who prays at the table? Who's gonna make the last decision in the family? Who's gonna get the biggest piece of meat in the family? All those different things begin to play a part in that. So I just want to say thank you for sharing. And it definitely brought up some memories of some of my learning challenges and having to deal with this subject.
Thank you so much, my dear brother. I appreciate you sharing that, talking about the role of media, family. For some of us, even religion, you're right, plays a very integral role in our understanding of machismo and patriarchy. And gosh, I mean, I think of my own mother, right? That some of my own patriarchal views were also instilled in me by some of the women in my family, right? Who served the men first, who cleaned up after, who did a lot of things to kind of nurture this idea that women were caretakers to men. And, you know, and I love what Maria, so much of what Maria is saying in the chat, you know, that sometimes, you know, women enable this in men, and that's true. And it's been my experience to some extent that has happened as well. And so anyone else, I mean, look in the chat, I want to see, we've learned our values and manners since we were kids. Our parents tell us dolls are for girls and cars are for boys, and the difference between how and men are treated. And some of it is indeed, you know, familial, comes out of that. And you know, some of it is not always malicious, but it has sometimes very, very dire consequences. This type of reaffirming of what it means to be, you know, a certain gender and what those norms are. When told, and I'm going to read this, when people told me that I could not do what a man did because I was a woman and was less than, then my mother explained to me that was wrong, that I could do whatever I wanted, and explained to me what machismo was. Then I kept growing and started noticing it more and more. And it's true, you know, once we have, like, when we gain these lenses, and this is why these kind of conversations are so important. And I wish that we had these conversations in more formative years, you know, for us and us, because I just, you know, wish I would have better understood what these things meant and continue to grow at an earlier age, because some of the things that I was learning from my family are things that I needed to unlearn, and that took me a long time to do it. I have a similar experience that I wish, Tony saying this, that I could take back. Muhammad Ali once said, the man who views the world the same at 50 as he did at 20 wasted 30 years of their life. Amen, man, that we have work to do. And for me, it was being picked on by my brother and my father, telling my mom that she was making me a sissy. I learned about being a man from my uncles and from my grandfather. Man, I had uncles who would they only had one pair of boxing gloves, and they would make us go in the street and tie one hand around our back and make us punch each other to see who was toughest. Right? I remember playing games in the park. One of the games we played, and I hate it now that I think about it, was called Smear the Queer. And it was about, like, it was not only, you know, heteropatriarchal, it was, you know, it was homophobic, and it was all these things. And you just think of, like, even turning sport into to kind of hyper masculinity. I remember doing these things, and these are the ways that I was learning, right? Learning what these ideals were and what this meant. I want to share one of my good friends is a gentleman named Wade Davis, and he's a former NFL player, and he has a beautiful YouTube video called "The Mask of Masculinity," and his work around masculinity. And you think of, there's probably not a more hyper masculine space than in football locker rooms. I've seen some of the worst exhibitions of patriarchy, homophobia in these spaces. And Wade Davis, who I had the honor to go to school with as a freshman and to play with, was the first NFL player to come out and does amazing work. And he talks about this mask of masculinity that we put on. And so much of what has been said already is around that, from our uncles who are kind of tattooing that mask on us to say, this is what it means to be, you're going to go cook with the women, you're going to be soft, you're going to be those things, all those things that, and a lot of them are associated with gendered norms, right? That you're going to be a little girl, you're going to be doing those things. And so it's so pervasive at such a young age. And if we can look to, learning theorists, like, who were those more knowledgeable others, right, for us, that were teaching us those things. And knowledgeable is relative in this sense, right? And so I really encourage you to look to Wade Davis and some of the work that he does around masculinity, because he operates such an interesting space as a former NFL player and a brave, amazing human being who speaks of and tries to undo masculinity in the way that we understand it. And he says this, Wade says, masculinity is a performance and a mask we men wear to shield ourselves from pain. And the performances of masculinity never, ever means freedom and self-love. I perform masculinity for large portions of my life, and even do still to this day at some times. And I need people to hold me accountable to these performances. And I think it's really important for us to do those types of things, because if we truly love ourselves and we're looking to be free, it is imperative that we do that necessary work of reconciling some of the things that we have done. And we can look to brave folks like Bell Hooks, Wade Davis, some of my colegas who do beautiful work around that. But there's one person who has done and helped me understand what it meant to be a man. And he does some of the most amazing work as well, not only in terms of self-work, but also how do we critique society in a better way? How is masculinity represented in films, in television ads, and in culture? And how does it converge also with race and sexuality? I think that's important, is that this is very complicated, that we're talking about the Latino community, but our understanding of this was so incredibly important in seeing that. And James Baldwin has done so much, has enabled me to do so much work and undoing of my faux notions of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a human, right? And here's what he says, and I'm just going to share this beautiful quote. And he says, in a place of America's long-standing myths about what a man should be, Baldwin calls for a new vision of identity, not constructed by fear of the other or by violent hierarchies, but by reciprocity, complexity, border crossing, and becoming. And I love that he enters in border crossing, because there are so many cultures that we can look to that do disrupt patriarchy, that as Tony talked about, that do value matriarchy. And I see in the chat, there's so many things in there like, Inicio, like in the west side of Albuquerque, if you don't get into one fight, you were labeled bad. You were labeled that you weren't tough, that you didn't earn your stripes. And at what cost did those things come from, right? It says, when I came out, I was told that I was less than worth. It's because I'm never going to have a man. And because I don't even feel like a woman, I was an abomination. These are the impacts that we're saying about these types of belief systems. And I thank you for sharing that and for being so brave and the impact of those things. It's so incredibly important for us to talk about, and we need to do the work to undo us from that work. I called my dad this morning, and I want to give us some time to to open up for comments in chat, and told him that I was giving this talk. And, you know, like Tony said, he's a different man now than he was probably, you know, 40, 50 years ago. And he thought it was a beautiful thing to be talking about, a necessary thing to be talking about, something that he wished that he could have talked about at a younger age. And this is a man who taught me some of the worst tropes around masculinity as a young kid. Maybe not verbally, maybe not explicit, but through his behaviors is where I learned a lot of those things. And he said 3 things to me this morning. He said, be gracious. And he's like, I'm going to give you 3 G's this morning, because he knows, you know, he said, be gracious, be generous, and be grateful. These are all things that I don't ever recall seeing my dad do much of. And yet he in talking about masculinity, he's looking at grace. And that's a term that we usually use, right? That it's not with men, right? Oh, how graceful is this person, you know? And she walks with grace, or all those things, right? And generosity and being grateful for the moment that we have. I'm so grateful to have been here with you all, talking about this very important topic, sharing with you all, growing with you all. And I'd love at this moment to open it up to any questions or comments or things that we can talk about, because one thing that I generally do is I come to race equity work, to justice work, with a deep sense of humility, knowing that I do not have truth with a capital T, but I'm about the journey to finding better truths. And so with that, I'd love to open it up to any comments, questions that we can share together.
I want to throw a couple things out there. This is Benicio, and again, thank you so much for being with us this morning and your presentation. I wanted to ask what you all think about how deeply ingrained is this into our children. Do you also think that it's so ingrained that it's now kind of hardwired into children's brains? I have a 6-year-old son, and you know, we talk about inclusivity, intersectionality, and my children identify as half Chinese and half Chicano. But there are times when my son will go around and he'll say, or he'll tell his sister, you can't do that, that's for boys. Or he won't do something and he'll say, I'm not doing that, that's for girls. And I'll ask him, where did you learn that? Because I know I didn't teach you that. Where did you learn that? And he goes, I don't know. It's just what I thought it was supposed to be like. I never taught him anything like that. His mom doesn't teach him anything like that. We're very careful about who his friends are. I mean, we've been in quarantine, so he's been at home since March. But I mean, these things, you know, I'm like, where the hell is he getting these things? And like, I want to ask, like, do you think these things have been so hardwired into our brains that children are being born with this shit?
Well, it's learned, right? For sure. I think that it's not ontological. I don't think it's a part of our being. I think it's epistemological. It's a part of our knowing. But even though you're trying to actively work against, you know, disrupting these norms, every time you go to the store, just about every time, think of every time you even check out of a supermarket, all of those magazines there are reifying these norms, right? Are very, not even subtly putting these norms in there. Walk through the toy aisle, right? That in and of itself, for very young folks, right, are already seeing these norms play out, right? Whether it's with regards to dolls, I was in the chat earlier, with regards to color norms, with regards to all of these things that you're talking about. So they're being inundated with this everywhere. And it's so hard to kind of mitigate that because of how ubiquitous this is. And, you know, I mean, we just think of folks being elected as known misogynists. And the fact that not only that happens, not only that it is not a dismissive factor in voting, but it was not even a factor with so many folks who identify as those who are on the receiving end of that type of behavior. And so it is so prevalent, it is so ubiquitous. That is why these types of conversations need to be had, and we need to be holding each other accountable. And so I commend you, you know, as you let in, I do work around critical race parenting, and we can't talk about race and patriarchy without talking about patriarchy. And so for us, that's an integral part of what you're doing. And to what you're saying, that question shows just how hard it is to do, even with the best intentions. And so I really appreciate you lifting that up, brother, because this work is perpetual. It is, we have to continue to invest, and we have to continue to mitigate so that we can change these narratives and these norms so that our children can be more fully human as well. Other questions? I see. Gabriel Trujillo says that I never fit in with the stereotype of what a man was. All of my friends were girls, and I was bullied for not being manly enough. I was told that being gay made me less, another chat, made me less than a man. And I used to think that the reason I was gay because my mom raised me on her own. But then I realized that it was society that brought in these notions of what it was to be a man and or a woman. Now, with my little brother, I see how they think of gender norms as being set in stone, and how blue is for boys and pink is for girls. And I know in school, they learn through their friends as well. Absolutely, hermano. And I appreciate you sharing. And I'm sorry, you know, for that, man. We need to do better in terms of this, and that, you know, trying to understand why someone is or isn't is part of the problem. You are you, and you're a perfect version of you, man. And no culture, society, or norm should erode at that. And so if I can, you know, help, and any of us can help in any way so that we can see each other as more fully human, that's a beautiful thing. And these conversations are needed. And again, someone says, if you think of something is unnatural and creates hate and difference, stand up and don't participate in such behavior. Walk out of the room. When the cooler minds prevail, talk about it with people who are open. Every day is an opportunity to change, not only our own behavior, but our own actions. And it's time to, like Senator Lewis said, get in good trouble. Absolutely. And Ashley says, basically the environment where the child is grown up with will define child attitudes. Absolutely. That's so much of our our lived lenses are informed by where we grew up and where we grow up. But this is why it's so important for those of you that are on this call and doing this work, whether you're an educator, an activist, parent, brother, sister, cousin. Like, we are educators in every moment. And as you know, as Maria says, we have the opportunity to disrupt some of those things. And don't get me wrong, there are other cultural norms in terms of respeto. Like, you know, if your abuelo or your abuela is over here spewing something, sometimes our culture demands that you don't disrupt and you don't disrespect. You know, but there's a way to take someone aside and say, listen, I want, you know, to tell you that I don't agree with that. And that, you know, that just simply because, you know, you're in the kitchen or you're doing things that don't fit within our culture doesn't make you any less human or any less part of who we are as a people. So that's such a beauty. I mean, I think we can do so much. And for me, I can think of so many times in my life where I was silent, and we know that that's not a neutral act, and that I allowed for these types of understandings and these types of norms to persist at great cost to so many people that I care so deeply about. And so there is an action that we need to take and get in that good trouble. So I appreciate those comments. Any other thoughts or comments I'd love to welcome and open up?
I think that what you said is really powerful, because I think that's probably one of the hardest things to do, is to dismantle family values or traditions that exhibit hate, right? You know, we talk about, like, you know, anti-Blackness in Latinx communities is huge, huge. And, you know, being able to pull your grandpa or your dad or somebody aside to say, look, that's not right. And that's not how, like, it's not like that. We need to fix this. We need to change your mindset. You may not agree, but that's not my view, and that's not how I am. And I mean, I've told close friends and close family before, like, you want to talk like that or be like that, like, I don't need to come around. You know, I think that's one of the hardest things to do, is to dismantle those family values and traditions that exhibit hate.
I completely agree, Benicio. This is Fabian, by the way. I think that it's that's something that I struggle with a lot. Like my father, I look up to him like crazy, but like I think of some of the things that he's, instilled in me, and it's just like, not that he's a prejudiced person, but it's just from the culture. Like I just remember from like when I was a kid, he would always say mariconadas las mínimas, and like that's like a really offensive thing. Like, and it's like, but that's like what I've like lived like as a kid growing up. Like he would always say that mariconadas las mínimas, and like to me that's like a, I don't know, like a piece of sage wisdom that my dad has given me, but like it tears me up like inside, because it's like it's also messed up. It's not like it's not a positive message.
And Fabian, thank you for sharing that, and you speak on that, right? So many of those teachings that we have, um, that have persisted for generations, right? That there's a deep sense of necessity, but also risk in disrupting that, and it's necessary work, man. If we're going to think of a more just society, then those are the types of things that we need to undo, and it's gonna be hard. But and part of me, this is that neuroplasticity, right? That we can unlearn, and our neural pathways and synapses are well formed. Neuroplasticity shows us that we can unlearn and relearn certain things even at older ages. So a lot of times we've been dismissive of helping our elders relearn certain things, but that's work that we can do, and it's work even for some of us, as I get older, that I need to continue to do, as I said. So I just really encourage you all to do that work, and to even just engage in conversations, even if you might not change. I think sometimes just hearing another perspective also provides an additional lens to better understand some of those things. And another comment in the chat, there's an unfortunate catch-22 is that many parents still reinforce gender and sexuality role expectations in order to protect their children from discrimination, but in doing so perpetuate many discriminatory and exclusionary ideologies and stereotypes. Oh, man, I remember my favorite Theo, who was queer. We all knew he was queer, but my grandmother was in denial about it, and then there was a pivot to be like, well, we just don't want him to not get a job or to be beat up or something, right? And so then it was again trying to protect him from who he was, and instead of looking at the problem with society, in our culture, the problem was him, that he needed to change. And it was, as you said, a tough place to be in for the familia, but also I can't even imagine for my Theo, who was, lived a lie for 40 years of his life, and just the cost of that, emotional cost of that, what that means, and so, and it's just, we need to unlearn and relearn, as Abenicio said, and do that work. And it's just deeply important. So, Abenicio, how long do we can keep going, right? Can I keep going?
Yeah, you probably have about maybe 40 minutes left.
Oh, okay. First, I thought we were at the hour mark, so I'm glad.
I mean, you can, I mean, people are engaging. It's cool.
Yeah.
I have to jump off for 1 o'clock, and then, but you also have co-hosts on here who can help monitor the chat and assist. And
For sure.
yeah, you're good to go still.
I appreciate it. Another comment in there is my mother would have fights with people because she was letting her sister and I play with boy toys, cars, and bicycles, that we needed to be playing with dolls. Yeah, and there's a policing that exists from also like neighbors and family and stuff with regards to this, especially around shaming other parents who are looking at a more open and broad sense of raising children. And so that's such an important thing to say, is because it's not just sometimes within the family, it's within society and or norms. And I remember of just what it means to have other people impose their beliefs on you, whether it's religious and or cultural, on what your family looks like. And so that's such an important aspect, I think, as well. And another comment, it's so funny, we must realize we don't choose to who and what color we are born. What if we decided to walk into that child or person's shoes? Will shock what we will learn and will shock and change our behavior towards color, race, religion. Yeah, I mean, that's perspective and that's empathy, right? And that's being open to different perspectives. That, I mean, that's so vital, I think, to these discussions and to this work and doing it. And I just encourage you all to look to these stories and these testimonials of really brave folks who have done really amazing work around understanding this paradigm and this notion. And I mean, and it is a difficult place to be. I have cognitive dissonance around my understanding with masculinity and gender. Is that, you know, there are men in my family who I look to, who I love very deeply, who are flawed, but they have really wonderful traits as well that I've looked to in terms of their commitment to familia, to making sure that people had opportunities, you know. And so I just think that is also part of the work, that we can simultaneously hold a couple of beliefs at the same time, that we have the ability to have dissonance. But what's problem is when we allow that dissonance for really insidious behavior to persist. That's no longer cognitive dissonance. That's just, you know, supporting terrible behavior. So, you know, I don't want to belabor this, but if there's more comments or questions, I'd be happy to take them on. I'm so thankful to be here and to talk about this. And this has been a gift for me, not only in being able to talk about it, but also being able to share with some of you all, you know, this important topic during this important time, right? Because a lot of times during this month of celebration, we do celebrate the genius of our culture and of our people, but we also have to do that very deep, meaningful self-reflexivity work about how do we get better and how to become a more fuller, more accepting cultura también. So how do we do those things? So any other comments or questions?
Roberto, before you jump off and before the call ends, like what actions would you suggest that those on this call take back to start diving into the work and to begin, I guess, just dismantling some of the hate and dismantling some of the misconceptions?
You know, you said it, man. Honestly, the advice I have is do some self-reflexivity work with yourself. Like, you know, begin to think back to where you learned these norms, where you see them continue to manifest. And most importantly, when you feel that visceral feeling that, you know, like this isn't right, like we shouldn't be saying this, disrupt. You have to. Maybe it doesn't mean just calling someone out and ridiculing them. Maybe it's, you know, not in the moment, but it's, you pull someone aside and you tell them, like, this is, like, that's what you have to do, right? And disrupt and be supportive of difference. Like, that's, to me, it's so important. And so I think that is, if you can do anything, that is what I would do. Examine yourself, turn inward, and use that examination to become more full, and then go and disrupt when you see these things operate. And if we can do that, and all of us take a little bit of that, and we begin to slowly erode at this norm, I think it's more important than anything.
Benicio, it's Tony. I just wanted to say something before I go. Thank you for including me today. Roberto, it's great to see you, man, and thank you for blessing us with these thoughts today. It's been very nice to connect with people during this time where we're all separated from each other. The other thing I would say, I guess, is I think it's important to let people know when they are doing things right and when they're treating people the right way. I'm a father of 2 college-age boys and a younger girl, and had a situation this week where my oldest went back to college, and he's in Illinois, and was put in a tough position with some of his baseball teammates and his fraternity brothers about them basically dismissing concerns about sexual assault on campus. And he was the one lone voice saying, you can't dismiss that kind of stuff. You have to listen and be you know, willing to accept that happens and be willing to help victims. And I was proud of him. He didn't tell me that. His mother told me that as she took him back to college. And I doubt if he will tell me that, but it put him in a bad position with his peers. And I probably won't bring it up unless he does, because I don't know if he wants me to know that he was having a tough time this week. But I'll tell you, as a father, I was proud of him, and it felt like his mother and I have been successful, at least in that part of his life. So I think it's important to let people know, and I'm gonna have to figure out how to do that without destroying his confidence or his. I don't want to get too much into his space because he'll pull away. So, but I thought I'd share that because it was a good moment for me this week, and I really appreciate being part of this today. So thank you, Benicio, Roberto, and others for including me.
Thank you, man. Thank you for sharing, brother. And we need to reify and to support all those behaviors that do that. So I would encourage you just to tell him you're proud of him, in that moment, because standing up for what's right, being on the right side of history will always be a good thing, man. That's always going to be something of value and something to be celebrated. So thank you. It's so wonderful to see you, man. I appreciate you.
Yeah, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining. I know you have a busy schedule, but thank you for joining.
Thank you.
And then there was another in the chat that said, how can I touch these things with my father without trying to, to finish our conversation, and I come to this work from a deep sense of love, and even when I'm holding people accountable that I care about, I lead with love, I lead with grace, and it may not always land that way, but, for folks that you care so deeply about, you also care about their humanity. And that's what I talk about, even with folks who I know may not always land, and it may not even change the behavior. But for me, if I lead with love and grace and a better and more fuller understanding of to see people in more in their more kind of full sense of themselves, if we can do that, that's better, even the folks who may not do that. So that's what I do. And so, Benicio, muchísimas gracias, man, for this opportunity. To all of you who took time out of your busy schedules to talk about this important topic and to share together from really the deepest parts of my soul, I thank you. And I encourage you all to go out to develop your humanity and to be kind and gracious to one another and to disrupt this type of hatred and this types of bigotries in any way that you can. So thank you so much. I appreciate you all. Es un placer. Mil gracias.
Roberto, thank you so much for joining us today and being part of this talk and making yourself vulnerable and taking the risk to tell us about your history and who you were. And I think also about how you made the change. And I think that's what is the most important piece for us to take out of this, is that we can make a change, and we just have to dig deep within ourselves and do our own work. And that we can become better advocates, we can become just better human beings. And as you put it, to lead with love, I think is probably one of the most important pieces as we push forward. Some other individuals I wanted to just quickly note out there, how can we advocate? How could we be supportive about this? And I think one thing that Roberto said was call it out as you see it. And the other thing too is to celebrate successes, whether large or small. When you see somebody doing something right, let them know, because I feel like as human beings, we're quick to call somebody out and call out what we don't see as right. And oftentimes we neglect to commend those who are doing the right thing or who are doing good work. And those are important ways that we can continue to advocate and support. There's that advocate piece by calling it out, and there's that support piece by letting people know that they're doing good work. Roberto, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure, whether it's like from behind the screen or whether you and I are enjoying a cerveza and shooting the shit is what they call it. But thank you so much. This is recorded, and our amazing coordinator, James Speed, will likely get this up on YouTube. So please share this with your friends. I think what we'll be able to do is get the YouTube link out to those who are registered. And then please share with your colleagues, friends, and people who need to hear this talk. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Benicio. I'm the Director for Latinx Student Services. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Omar Montgomery, Director for Black Student Services. Shout out to James Speed, Coordinator for the Center for Identity and Inclusion. Omar, if you have any last words, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
No, I think you summed up things perfectly. I don't need to add anything else.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. Don't forget, we have a full calendar for Latinx Heritage Month. We have La Llorona storytelling coming out next Tuesday. Please join us for that. We have a discussion and we have film screening. We also have Cinco de Mayo, Latinx history, so many other good things. Pay attention to the calendar. As things come up, they'll be sent out. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.